All right, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be with you today, and we're very honored to have Professor Padilla with us this morning from Princeton University. We're going to get started with Autumn, who will lead us in a brief moment of silence, and then Ivan will introduce our speaker.
1, 2, 3. One, two, three.
Good morning. It was rumored, I think, by Reed Morrissey that my first exposure to Homer was through The Simpsons. That is not true. But since we're going on an expedition to the antiquities and the classics, I wanted to get that out of the way. It is such a great honor to introduce the Professor Daniel Padilla Peralta, who has led a amazing life of both physical and intellectual peregrination, both geographically in terms of moving across the planet to find answers in remote places that are remote to us here in New York City. And he's also gone deep into time. So he's gone the two axes and in some ways crushed the time-space continuum. I want to give thanks again to Michael Tang, who I told Professor was the capo di tutti capi. He's the boss of bosses because he gets bosses in like Professor Padilla Peralta. I'm so grateful for his leadership in bringing the professor here. As you all know, Professor Padilla Peralta is a son of the Dominican Republic. And he's also a homie from New York. So he is Dominican, as he says in his bio, he's Dominican by birth and New Yorker by upbringing. And also he is a son of El Barrio. He spent a good portion of his childhood here in Spanish Harlem. Let me get to the bona fides. Summa cum laude from Princeton. No one does that. He was also the salutatorian. And at Princetoniensis, I think that's how you say it, at Princetoniensis, the salutatorian gives a speech full on in Latin. So he was selected to do that. And at that same graduation ceremony, he got to meet President Clinton. And so he's met everyone and anyone. And the way I see it, everyone who's anyone has gotten to meet Professor Daniel. So summa cum laude from Princeton. And then later he had a graduating scholarship and earned a master's degree in philosophy in Greek and Roman history at Oxford, which is in England, dear Albion, a PhD in classics from Stanford. Then he did a graduate postdoc at Columbia, and now he is a professor back at Princeton. And not only is a professor of classics in Princeton, but he's also affiliated with the program in Latino studies. And so that is what I talk about. He goes deep into history, but he's staying close to the heartbeat of the struggle of people of color, Latino people, undocumented people. He is a phenomenon. His research mainly focuses on the Roman Republic and the early empire. And we were getting a little cheat sheet on how to manage the pandemic. He talked about Thucydides' report of the plague in Athens and giving us some heart and hope, which is an amazing thing too, that he goes into the dark of the past and brings light for the people looking back at the past, but he also brings people in the present light from some of the challenges people met back in those times. He also works on classical reception in contemporary American and Latin American cultures. I heard a story of the professor going back to the Dominican Republic and almost getting arrested by military police because he wanted to capture the image of a statue to bring it back Promethean style back to the rest of us, so he could talk about the merging of the classics in a Caribbean setting. He also looks at issues that challenge us even now, conceptions and practices of citizenship, again, through time. And he's a public scholar. I mean, he is just in this moment. I've watched some of his videos and I read his memoir, but just in the moment that I've had with him and Michael in the green room, he's a deep scholar, but also a very captivating speaker. And he moves, seamlessly from hip hop to, as I mentioned, Thucydides and Greco-Roman conceptions of immigration. I want to say, I need to turn this over to him, but I do want to say, Professor, you said it at one point that you make sense of the world at the same time you empower the oppressed by going deep into history. You embody many of the values that are in our mission. And the first one, and the most compelling one to me when I was reading your memoir, is that you agilely adapt to change. And you also create and share a life of deep meaning, dynamic virtue, and transcendent joy. What a joy it is for me to welcome Professor Daniel straight out of El Barrio, Princeton, Oxford, Stanford. Welcome, and we're ready to learn at your feet.
That is a high octane introduction. It's going to be very hard for me to live up to all that you laid out. I mean, and what's so great about the introduction, apart from its generosity, is that it crystallized some of the themes that I want to work through in the course of the next 20 or so minutes. I'll give a very short presentation, and then I'll open it up for folks to ask questions about my life arc and what it is that I do and why it is that I do it and what I hope to see as the rewards of the kind of knowledge and community building that seem to me to be so vital for this moment. I'm going to share just a few slides. They have images. The images will help me work through some of the arguments for our time together that I hope to leave you folks with. So I'll talk first about the life arc, where I came from, what my experiences in the United States have been, and how those experiences define and inform much of the work that I carry out now. So here on this slide, in the upper left, you see a photo of me standing outside a bodega in the Bronx in 1991, living my best bodega life. The memoir that Ivan referred to, Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, which came out in 2015, tried to give an account of my family's early years in the United States and my progression through education in the United States. There was one defining feature of our lives in the States, which the title of the memoir makes clear. We were undocumented. We came to the United States in 1989. My father, my mom, and I. My mother was expecting at the time. Originally, we came to seek medical care for my mother, and she was able to receive quality medical care at Columbia Presbyterian, where my younger brother was born. But although we had come on short-term visas, those visas expired and we fell into undocumented status. We were sin papeles. My parents tried to adjust our status, but one of the discoveries they made was that immigration laws in the United States are really complicated. They've only grown more complicated. This is something I'd be happy to discuss with you folks during the Q&A. One practical consequence of that, after we decided in 1990 that we would try to stay in the United States, is that it was very hard for my parents to find secure work. My parents were both being asked wherever they tried to work after a few months to provide work authorization, to provide papeles that authorized them to work, and they were unable to do this. Eventually in 1993, my dad returned to the Dominican Republic, and my parents separated and eventually divorced. The memoir discusses how my life in the United States unfolded as we looked for ways to adjust our immigrant status. Some of the events in the memoir focus primarily on the practical effects that not being in status had for each of us. So we couldn't leave the United States. When my mom's father, my maternal grandfather, passed away in the Dominican Republic, we couldn't go to his funeral. But there were other aspects of this experience that, while not immediately apparent at the time, arguably had a more sinister and sort of deeper and pervasive impact. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. For folks who are interested in how I eventually got immigrant status in this country and permanent long-term status to remain in this country, the memoir gives you some of the story, but not all of the story, because some of this work to achieve legal status in the United States continued after the memoir was being published. One of the hardest hurdles to clear occurred in 2015, 2016, because I became eligible for a green card after marrying my longtime partner. But we then discovered that because I had been undocumented in the United States for the entirety of my childhood and the early part of my adulthood, I had to apply for what's called a waiver of grounds of inadmissibility, which is a technical expression meaning that I had to ask the Immigration Service to allow me to change my status, even though I was, in their view, not eligible to change my status. And in order to submit a successful application, you have to demonstrate that your being deported or sent out of the United States would create extreme hardship for a US citizen. Extreme hardship is surprisingly difficult to prove. There's actually a New York Magazine article that just came out this week that describes the experiences of the author supporting their partner in the course of a 2-decade-long struggle with the Immigration Service. Extreme hardship is the kind of thing that is so difficult to demonstrate that many scholars of immigration policy have rightly argued that in its current form, the policy is immoral. But again, we can take that up in the Q&A and think more broadly about immigration policy. I'm now a permanent resident as of February 2017. That has meant all kinds of good things in my life, a measure of security for one, but what it has also impressed upon me is that my path to getting immigration status in the United States is not representative of the struggles that many, many tens of millions of people face, for whom, in the overwhelming majority of cases, there is no actual direct path to getting permanent residency, let alone citizenship. What were the substantive effects of our not having immigrant status, and in my mom's case, authorization to work when I was younger? We moved around a lot in my early years in the United States. And I, on this slide, in addition to a photo of my fam, also give you a list of where we lived for the entirety of my childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. We started out in the Bronx, 165th Street and Grant Avenue, around the corner from that bodega where I was standing one summer day in 1991, as you saw on the first slide. We moved briefly to Astoria. We spent some time in Washington Heights with fellow members of the Dominican American diaspora. We went back to the Bronx. We then went to Corona, Queens, Jackson Heights, Queens, another apartment, Jackson Heights, Queens. And it was from this apartment at the end of the 1993 school year, when I had just completed the 3rd grade, that we were evicted. We entered after spending a period of time in a basement in Elmhurst, the Emergency Relocation Center for displaced and temporarily unhoused families at 151st and Walton in the Bronx. From there, we moved to 2 shelters, one in Chinatown at Catherine Street, and the second in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where we spent all of my 4th grade year to the summer before my 5th grade year. After we were placed out of the shelter system, we moved first to an apartment in central Harlem, and then to a series of apartments in El Barrio, where my mom still lives at 416 East 116th Street. While we were moving around as a kid, I did not at first remark this as unusual. It was only when I started going to the school that Michael Tang and I have in common on Manhattan's Upper West Side, and met people who had like never moved apartments or houses in their lives, that I began to realize that there was something about this experience that had put me in a different space. Initially, especially as I began to develop friendships with folks who had had different life experiences, I thought that this moving around put me in a position of deficit, that it marked me as somehow in some way inferior to those folks who had a normal seeming life. In time, I came to realize that this moving around actually equipped me with some resources that were incredibly important to my ability to navigate different kinds of surroundings. All of this moving around had put a premium on my ability to be adaptable, to adjust. Now, I'm not going to come to you and say that all this moving around was in the end worthwhile, or that it was redeemed by virtue of like the skills that I acquired, because I think that one of the most important issues to take away from reading the memoir, or just from thinking about my life or lives similar to mine, is that no child should be subjected to this kind of stuff. No child should be subjected to this form of displacement. This is structural violence in its rawest form. What I will say is that this moving around did condition me in ways that I came to find very productive in the long run. It made me more at ease with the possibility that being on the move might actually be a good and rewarding thing. It also created some attachment issues. So feeling restless and never wanting to settle down, these were issues in my young adulthood that I had to work through. And those are some of the baggage that I trail. When I was at one of the shelters, the one at Chinatown, I came across a book, and I described this encounter briefly in the memoir. This book was eye-opening. It was eye-opening for reasons that were sort of clear to me at the time. It was eye-opening for reasons that came into focus when I was a teenager, and it was eye-opening for reasons that only became apparent when I was an adult. Let me provide a little bit of background to this encounter first. When we were in the Chinatown shelter, I spent a lot of time asking my mom questions about Caribbean history, about Dominican history in particular. I was, I was pretty nerdy and proud to be nerdy 3rd grader. I liked to know things. I liked to know history. I liked history books. But I was also interested in knowing more about my family's history and in knowing more about the circumstances that had led to my family coming to the United States. And so I thought that, asking my mom questions about Santo Domingo and where I had grown up would also be a way of getting some answers there. Clarifying for myself, what it was that my community's culture, the culture that had birthed me and sustained me in my first few years looked like, how it had formed historically. These were all questions that I would keep coming back to in the years after our time in the shelter, and that have remained a feature of my work as an academic. But one of the interesting things I discovered is that although my mom was this fountain of information, she could answer so many different questions about my culture, mis raíces, and the threads of our culture that we could tug at in New York City. There are very few books that I would come across that actually spoke about Dominican culture. we spent a lot of time in public libraries. When we were in the shelter system, especially during the days and on the weekends. If I wasn't at school, Mom would take my younger brother and me to public libraries nearby. And I would look for history books, and I would find US history books, and sometimes I would find history books about European countries. In the shelter system, I found the history book about Spain. But there were no history books about the Dominican Republic. There were no history books about Caribbean history, right? There was, however, this book about ancient Greece and Rome, this book that appeared on the shelves of the Chinatown shelter, and that I borrowed one day. I was a bad user of libraries then. I did not return this book. I still have this book. I have another copy of the book that I also found at another library some years later. Don't do this. Please return books to libraries. It's very important. I was struck by the opening paragraph of this book. It has left a pretty profound impression on me, which is why you see it on this slide. Western civilization, the book began, was formed from the union of early Greek wisdom and the highly organized legal minds of early Rome. The Greek belief in a person's ability to use his powers of reason, coupled with Roman faith and military strength, produced a result that has come to us as a legacy or gift from the past. This legacy has grown and blossomed into a smooth, colorful way of life, covering equally the arts and the sciences, the one and the many. So in the years after my initial encounter with this book, I would learn all these tools for taking apart these sentences, right? So one of the things that drew my attention then, and that has increasingly preoccupied me in the years since, is this smooth, colorful way of life business. So the Greeks and Romans are pretty violent, and their legacies are also pretty violent. So it was not obvious to me, and it is definitely not obvious to me now, that one can get off simply by saying that the legacy that has come down to them is smooth and colorful. But at the time that I encountered this book, it was a port of entry into this imaginative universe that had not existed for me prior to my encounter with this book. So here, as was true then and is true now, I find myself wrestling with two different ways of thinking about the encounter, this initial encounter that has set up so much of my life in the years since. On the one hand, this book was inspirational. It made open to me, it presented as accessible to me a constellation, a universe for historical exploration that was unlike anything I had previously encountered. So that's on the one hand, right? On the other hand, this book appeared in my life at a time of what some philosophers would call a period of epistemic injustice or epistemic deficit, right? I was looking for other resources that could explain aspects of my life, right? So the Caribbean history textbooks that I could never find, and these weren't around, right? So as a result of that deficit, I then turned to a book like this. But the question remains, what do you do to address that deficit, right? Because it's not immediately clear that you should simply embrace this book and say, this is my pathway, this is my redemption, this is my inspiration, without also taking into consideration the fact that there is this gap, that there is this lack of a structure for studying something like, say, Caribbean history, or developing proficiency and fluency in Caribbean history. This has meant that in practice, I have trained to be several different kinds of historian. So I have trained as someone who specializes in the ancient worlds of the Roman and Greek Mediterranean, but I also train as someone who remains vitally interested in questions of Caribbean history, of the transatlantic slave trade, out of which my family and so many families come from, and continue to find their lives impacted by. And at a more meta level, I have to be sensitive to what some philosophers, and here's Miranda Fricker, whose book I've quoted on this slide, have termed epistemic injustice. Under what conditions do some kinds of knowledge get presented to different communities, including historically oppressed communities, kinds of knowledges that may set them up to think that they have the tools to explain some of their experiences. And I definitely thought at the time that I had some tools for explaining my experiences by thinking about the ancient world, even as they deny access to other tools for understanding their experiences. Like, how important would it have been to me? How transformative would it have been for me if there had actually been books on Dominican history in the local libraries that I frequented? This is the question that's been uppermost in my mind ever since. I do a lot of different kinds of work in Roman history. So in my professional career, over the course of my training as a Roman historian at Princeton and at Oxford and then at Stanford, where I got my PhD, I became interested in how cultures learn and borrow from each other over time. And Roman culture in the ancient Mediterranean of the final few centuries BCE and first few centuries CE is exceptionally dynamic. It's always borrowing. There isn't any one Roman culture that is cleanly separable from other cultures. It is a culture that's constantly in a process of invention and reinvention. And so I worked a few years ago on a book on the dynamics of cultural appropriation that looked at how Rome systematically engaged with and learned from other communities in the Mediterranean and beyond the Mediterranean. The Indian Ocean was a point of engagement for Roman culture. There is emergent evidence showing that commercial and cultural contacts across the Sahara were becoming increasingly important to Roman culture. Roman culture has an Atlantic Ocean face. It extends from the Atlantic corridor all the way into Central Asia. So how do we talk about that? How do we theorize these different kinds of contacts? I'm also interested, though, in the history of religion at Rome. And this grew out of a very specific set of experiences that may be familiar to some folks. I spent a lot of time in church when I was growing up in Central Harlem, Spanish Harlem. I was going, my family was going to church 5 to 6 days a week. Church was the dominant after school fixture of my high school years. And although I am the world's most lapsed Catholic, I spend a lot of time thinking about the relationship between religious practice and community building. And this was the theme of a book I wrote that came out in 2020, last fall, that looks at how in the Roman world in particular, and in the period that's of interest to me, the 4th, 3rd, and early 2nd centuries BCE, religion is a way for people to structure relationships with each other around big structures like temples that organize various forms of social interaction. This work has continued to take me and collaborators in multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary directions. I'm currently at work on a book with a team of contributors that looks at all of these different kinds of approaches that you can bring to bear on the study of Roman history during my period. I'm going to talk about one specific kind of approach, climate-centered approaches, and their significance for us in a moment. But the final thing I'll say is that as I engage in all of this work, the questions that were on my mind as I processed my experiences in the shelter system and my encounter with the textbook that I noted on the previous slide are never far away from me. At the core of much of my current work is an interest in thinking about how racial dynamics and racialization affect the different kinds of conceptual tools that we are allowed to make use of in the first place. And this means that I have to train in different kinds of spaces too. Like I have to enter into conversation with folks in Black studies and in critical race theory who have been developing these tools for understanding how different disciplines, different forms of knowledge, different ways of imagining the world make use of and activate concepts and approaches that are buttressed by various forms of white supremacy. The study of classics is one of these. Like classics and white supremacy have been bound up together for a long time. At the heart of my motivation to continue the work that I do in classics is the belief that classicism is a resource. It is not the only resource. It should not be the privileged of privileged resources, but it is a resource for working with other communities to expand the range of what is constituted as classical. In more practical terms, this means that we would need to think about many other pre-modern communities as classical, right? So this would involve looking at, for example, the communities of the pre-contact Americas and thinking about ancient Maya cultures, ancient Aztec cultures, Inca cultures, and so on, as deserving of a place in our accounts of what the classical looks like. Sub-Saharan African communities, communities in the Indian Ocean, like adopting a genuinely global perspective on what classicism is and what classicism can do. So for this work, I do a lot of reading. I spend a lot of time with amazing writers. I have 3 books on this slide that have been really transformative for me for different reasons. The first is Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, that looks at the transatlantic slave trade through a combination of historical scholarship, archival research, and biography and autobiography. Hartman has been really instrumental among historians of slavery and of the legacies of slavery in developing approaches that rely on creativity and on what she has called critical fabulation, right? So how do you imagine the lives of people who don't leave conspicuous, visible marks in the historical record? How do you give voice to folks who have been denied the ability to voice their experiences in literary sources or in archaeological sources for that matter? Part of that work involves thinking about silence and what it means when we don't have sources. So here I will raise up the work of the late Haitian anthropologist Michel Trouillot, Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History, which was hugely important for me in my own training. Trouillot is so amazing at thinking about how you do work in situations where at first you're just presented with silence. Like if you want to think about communities of enslaved persons in pre-modern cultures or in early modern cultures or in modern cultures, you are often confronted with these deficits or these lacks of evidence. So how do you do this work? How do you do it ethically? How do you prepare other scholars to enter into that space with responsibility and commitment? This is the kind of project that Trouillot in the course of his life really devoted a lot of energy to. Trouillot is also important for another reason. So recently, a team of scholars put out an edited collection of his essays, including one of his old students, Yarimar Bonilla. And one of the essays has this remarkable line in which he talks about diversity, about equity and diversity. And Trouillot, in the later years of his life, became very critical of what he saw as tokenizing efforts, bringing folks of color into the room, only then to make it difficult for them to actually succeed and flourish. And he was particularly attuned to the significance of this in the academy. And one of the things that he raised in one of his last essays was the idea that even when people talk a big game about diversity, they don't take diversity seriously, and I'll quote him now, as an intellectual value. Right. So for him, the work that animated much of the later years of his life was to make other people understand why it is that folks from historically minoritized and underrepresented groups carry knowledge with them that is actually meaningful if we are to do things like study history or study the cultures of other communities in time and space, right? That was Trouillot's great undertaking. Finally, I'll point out the work of Marisa Fuentes, who has done excellent and richly imaginative work on enslaved women and freed women in the early modern Caribbean, and who has developed all of these different tools for thinking about the voices and the voicing of enslaved women in particular. I spent a lot of time thinking with Latin texts. With ancient Greek texts too, this slide has some Latin. It's taken from a play of the Roman playwright Plautus, who put on plays at the end of the 3rd century BCE and the beginning of the 2nd century BCE. Many of his plays focus on the lives of enslaved people, and in one of the scenes that has gotten a lot of attention recently, the playwright focuses on an exchange between an enslaved person and the person who is trying to sell that enslaved person. And one of the most upsetting and disquieting aspects of the literature that I do consult and that I regularly study is that it brings you up to confronting the many forms of violence that exist in the archive. You can see traces of how people were exploited in the ancient world in these texts. You can see what kinds of experiences they were forced to endure as a condition of their clinging on to life. And so that is something that I spend a lot of time trying to address in the forms of scholarship that I carry out. But I also spend a lot of time thinking about environment in antiquity and changes in environment in antiquity. And this is the fastest, if not the fastest moving field in ancient studies, certainly among the fastest moving. So if you go to Greenland with a research team, and ideally you would need to be very well funded to do this, and you drill ice cores and you study the deposits of ice in these glaciers, they tell you a story of what happened environmentally across long stretches of time, tens of thousands of years. But thanks to advances in science, we can be very specific now in dating specific changes in these ice sheets to specific transformations in the ancient world. And I'm going to single out two. First, in the course of the final few centuries BC and the first few centuries CE, there is a lot of lead pollution in the atmosphere globally, but especially in the northern hemisphere. Why is that? The ice cores tell us this. We can track changes in lead pollution pattern because the lead pollution goes up in the sky and then it comes down in the form of snow and it deposits on the glaciers in Greenland and other parts of the Arctic Circle. And we can study this lead pollution deposits and their changes over time. The reason there's so much lead pollution is because Romans are engaging in mining. They mine for silver and for gold, but especially for silver. And this really messes up the environment, like a lot. One of the signals for this is lead pollution in the atmosphere. And we can see that over the course of the period that I study, there is this spike in lead pollution because Romans are mining to acquire silver. What do they use? What are the technologies available to them to do this kind of work? We have mines that have been excavated or that are still out in the open in places such as the Iberian Peninsula. So Spain in particular was very well worked. Romans don't have mechanical mining machines. They don't have mechanical excavators or anything like this. So they have to use very large teams of enslaved persons. And mining was brutal in antiquity. Many people died doing it. So in thinking about what the environmental record tells us, we can also think about the kinds of labor conditions and the forms of human subjection and violence that define this economic transformation over time. Normally, when we talk about ancient worlds, ancient communities, and the precious metal objects that come out of that world, we tend to think of things like coins, and you see some coins on this slide. These coins all come from the period after Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE. The assassination of Julius Caesar is a seismic event in antiquity. It transforms the political systems of the Roman Republic. It creates the conditions for the emergence of a new political order that will take over much of Western Eurasia, the Roman Empire. And generations of historians have understood that assassination as setting in motion all of these processes. The assassination was also the subject of a joke that was told to me when I was a kid, and that appears in the memoir. Desde que Bruto mató a César, los brutos viven sin cesar. This is a joke that puns on the names of one of Caesar's assassins, Marcus Junius Brutus. But what if I told you that the assassination, while a pretty important thing, wasn't the most important thing that happened in the Roman and, in fact, global world of the first century BC. Here is where we got to turn to a new form of evidence. This is, again, derived in part from ice core analysis. Roman sources tell us that after Julius Caesar's assassination, people were seeing things in the sky. Comets, all this stuff. They like report all of these atmospheric disturbances. And now this is where we get to the coolest part of what it is I do on a daily basis. I get to work with people who know far more about ancient environment and ancient climates than I do. When I read these reports in the ancient literary sources about comets in the sky or about meteors falling and streaking through the clouds, I tend to think, well, you know, People saw some things, all right, but I don't have a framework in which I can sort of properly develop an analysis for this. Well, not too long after Julius Caesar's assassination, there was a huge, and I mean huge, volcanic eruption. It was not in the Roman world. It occurred off the coast of Alaska. This was one of the biggest volcanic eruptions to have occurred in the past 3 millennia. It was so big, and it deposited so much pollutant in the atmosphere that it led to a brief period of global cooling. The temperature dropped, especially in the northern hemisphere. And we can track this through ice core analysis. We can track this by looking at tree rings of very, very old trees. We can look at a whole host of environmental proxies to understand the relationship between this major volcanic eruption and all of the political and cultural changes that occur in the decades after Julius Caesar's death. Now, the thing is, the Romans themselves did not know about this volcanic eruption. The Romans were not in contact with communities off the coast of Alaska. Romans were not traveling to the Western Hemisphere. We know that this was not something that they understood to be linked to a volcanic eruption. But we can now tell, thanks to the collaborations between scientists and humanists, a very, very rich story of how changes in climate, driven by things like volcanoes, but also driven by, in some cases, human-generated imprints on climate and human responses to climate, leave a lasting mark on the communities that I study. And this has all kinds of relevance for how we understand contemporary culture. We are in a period of profound climate transformation. And so one of the responsibilities that I see us as having to embrace in the years and decades to come is how we think about ancient history in a way that enables us to develop resources for better appreciating our obligations in this current moment, and also building new knowledges that help us confront the challenges that are still in store for us. So that's where I'm wrapping up. This is the work I do. This is why I love it so much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Wow, thank you so much. That was fascinating. We have a ton of questions. I do want to be mindful of your time. We don't want to keep you all morning, but our 8th graders do have several questions they'd like to ask you. Let's start with Zanai, actually, who you met in the green room. Zanai, I'm going to throw it to you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Anaya, and I would like to thank you for being our virtual speaker today. I've learned that you grew up in the U.S. as an undocumented person and faced the adversities of homelessness. How did these experiences shape who you are as a person today?
That's a wonderful question. I'd say that the experiences and the adversities made it possible for me to undertake different kinds of work. But first, I should say that even though I experienced these adversities and these experiences, and I'm speaking in the first person as someone who can reflect on those experiences, my life would not be possible without the communities that made that life bearable, that made that life worth living to the full. What the experiences I had impressed on me was, first of all, the importance of community, the need to develop community, the need to sustain community. And second, the resolve in the long term to work towards a world where my kinds of experiences and the lives that my family had to endure, the traumas my family had to endure, are ones that other people do not have to endure. So this has made it a complicated journey on 2 different levels. On the one hand, it's been very much a matter of how I relate to the institutions where I was trained and taught, that folks focus on what they see as exceptional about my life, right? But one of the things I've tried to tell people over the years is that there were many people in El Barrio, in Washington Heights, in the Bronx, and Corona, who had the intellectual firepower to kick ass in all aspects of life. Were they given the opportunities that I was? No. And that to me is incentive enough for recognizing that the experiences that I had demand me to assume certain political commitments that will make opportunities like the ones I had available to everyone, right? There's another side to this, although I have become a little wary of using some of the language I'm about to use. When I was younger, I thought that my experiences had equipped me with a sort of limitless amount of resilience. Because I thought, I mean, if I survive this, like, it's gonna be all right. I could do pretty much anything. And this was the subject of a talk that my younger brother gave at my wedding. One of the things that he pointed out was that when we were teenagers, especially when we were young teenagers, we had a really difficult time imagining what our lives would be like after we turned 25. Now, there were like really practical and obvious reasons that will be obvious to many of you. So like, I couldn't imagine what life was like beyond 25 because I didn't know all that many people who were older than 25. I didn't know that many people were older than 25 because like a lot of people were getting killed, like when I was growing up in Central Harlem. When we made it through that, my younger brother and I, we were in this sort of state of euphoria at points in our young adulthood. Like we were like, if we survive this, like there is nothing that could hold us down. Like we got this, you know. My euphoria has been checked of late. I think one of the more sobering aspects of this adult hustle is that you realize that there are things that will really come at you for which you have very little preparation. And they are like wildly unpredictable, even if some of their appearances follow a certain rhythm. Things like taking care of your elders, for example. Like this was something that I had not given sufficient thought to when I was younger. Like I thought, you know, I'm the ambassador of my family. Like I always got to translate for my parents or like do all this hustle, but like then I'll be an adult and like they'll also be adults and that'll be it. Nah. Like my whole life, like a lot of it is spent dealing with older folk and like continuing to support older folk. Like that never leaves, right? But I feel responsible to that because if there is one concrete lesson to take away from the experiences I had as a child, it is the overwhelming importance of community. Without community, this is not a livable life, right?
Thank you for sharing. I think what you shared, especially about like translating for parents, resonates so much with so many of our students. I'm going to throw it to Suri next. She has a question for you. Here you go, Suri.
Good morning. I read that you're a professor in the classic department of Princeton University and hope to make this a more welcoming department for the first generation of students and students of color. What are some things you do to make sure that happens?
It's very much a work in progress. One of the things that we try to do is create opportunities for folks to meet and talk about their experiences, especially as first generation students. So I spent a fair amount of time advising undergrads especially. So I'm a residential college advisor, which means that I meet with a group of first and second year students quite regularly just to talk about things like course selection, how you navigate this place, what kinds of decisions you have to make in order to set yourself up to succeed here, all that stuff. But as part of that work, one of the most important things is to attend to what scholars have referred to time and again as the hidden curriculum, right? So especially if you come from circumstances of privilege, there's all this like knowledge you have about how these places work that folks who are denied access to those kinds of privileges do not have, right? So let me give you like one concrete example that's been much discussed in these parts. We, all of us who teach here hold office hours, right? The purpose of office hours is to get students to come by to our office and just talk to us about any issues they're having, any difficulties they're encountering with their work. One of the things that many colleagues and I have noticed over the years, and that has been backed up by a lot of research, is that there is a stark gap in the representation of students who come to our office hours. So the students who tend to come to my office hours, or who tended to come to my office hours, at least until the start of the pandemic, were students who are already super well prepared. Like they had privilege and then some. They were overwhelmingly white or beneficiaries of various forms of white privilege. They would come to office hours, but students who had not had a structure in place that told them that it was okay to come and meet with a professor, that it was not going to be a source of judgment if they came to the office to meet with the professor. They were not coming at all. Right? So part of the work of building up, by my department, my college, my university, into a more hospitable space for first generation students especially, is in introducing students in as many ways as possible to the idea that faculty, staff, administrators here are living resources that they should rely on. And it's okay to rely on us, that we're here to be relied on, but that we're also here to make it feasible and desirable for them to come to us, to have conversations with us, to learn with us. But that also means that like a lot of my colleagues and I have to retrain, right? Like we have to be very sensitive to the many ways in which even the most seemingly innocent or casual comment can be a vehicle for microaggression, and sometimes for macroaggression too, right? Oh, you didn't read this already? Oh, this thinker whom you've never heard of, but I'm just dropping this name, right? So all of these kinds of assumptions that just assert themselves in everyday life over here are ones that you have to sort of consciously struggle against, right? Like, how do you present material to folks in a way that invites them in without shutting the door on them? How do you balance your own excitement, your own willingness to nerd out, with your responsibility to present material in a way that will grab, but that will also be as accessibly premised as possible, right? These are the questions that inform our practice. I'll say one more thing in response to the question, though, because it's something that I am going to address at a meeting this afternoon with other colleagues. So I'm preparing myself for this. Especially at institutions like Princeton, there's been, like all of this effort over the past few years to show off these numbers that demonstrate that the university is becoming a more inclusive and receptive space for first generation low-income students and students from historically minoritized groups. And my employer always shows off these numbers, put on very nice charts, they appear on our website. But it's one thing to have the students here. It's another thing to build durable structures that enable them to flourish, right? And so the second half of that is the more important thing. Because you could bring all the students here. It's not gonna matter if they hate it. It's not gonna matter if they all leave traumatized by the experience of being here. So that to me is the biggest calling. How do you create structures that enable people to flourish? What are the steps you need to take to make sure that everyone feels welcome here, right? That's at the level of teaching. That's at the level of co-curricular stuff. That's at the level of all of the little experiences beyond the classroom that define how people develop senses of self-esteem and collective esteem. You gotta be attentive to all that.
Thank you so much, Professor. Do you have time for 2 or 3 more questions? Okay, perfect. Let's go to Rigel next. He has an interesting question for you. Rigel, here you go.
Hi, my name is Rigel. I'm in the 8th grade, and I have read that you are a strong critic of the whiteness that exists in the classics. How would you define the concept of whiteness, and what are your suggestions on how to remove it from your field of study?
Another excellent question. So I would define the whiteness in several forms, right? So the first and most conspicuous form, hold on a second. There we go. Is just in the composition of the field itself in the United States. Like if you look at, say, university professors, high school teachers, middle school teachers who are teaching Latin, who are teaching ancient history or ancient civilization, who are teaching Greek, there is an overwhelming concentration of white folks doing this, right? So there are reasons for this. So like actual substantive reasons for this that have to do with the opportunities that people are presented, the kinds of professions that are deemed valuable or advisable for folks of color to pursue, and this creates a cycle, right? But I'm also interested in disciplinary history. In other words, how a field like classics and ancient studies more generally, over time, evolves around certain baseline assumptions, certain ways of interpreting material that are actually bound up with the racial identities of the people who practice the teaching and writing about that material. So here is where I turn to one of my favorite examples, museums. There's a lot, as folks will know, if you visited the Metropolitan Museum or if you've gone to some of the other museums in the city, we have such amazing collections at these museums, right? Especially of ancient stuff. How did that stuff get to these museums? This story is not pretty. And often it has to do with the emergence of white settler colonialism and of white imperialism by the empires of the global north. So I'm thinking not just of the British Empire, for example, or the French Empire, thinking also of US Empire, of the US's capacity to project its power globally. One of the ways that manifests is in the ability showcased at these museums to take stuff from communities all around the world and pile them up back home. That to me is where we can see the interrelationship between the kinds of whiteness that I discuss, especially in some of my work, and knowledge practice over time, right? Because when this kind of looting, because it is looting, happens, there's very little discussion of how this kind of looting and theft affects communities who are seeing their valuables taken away from them, right? Nowadays, there's like a really big conversation underway about whether museums have an obligation to repatriate, to send back objects that have been acquired illegally to host communities. But there's a lot more to do than simply send back. Like we have to think of something like reparations. So let me give one illustration of this. Multiple museums in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in France have extensive collections that have been built up of Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Assyrian, and other cultural artifacts from the ancient Near East. Many of these have been stolen from Iraq. The stealing, processing, funneling of all of these artifacts and these cultural goods was made possible in the early decades of the 20th century by colonial regimes, such as these empires that I mentioned earlier. And it continues to be made possible by ongoing political crises in the region, which many of you will be familiar with. There are many museums that have these artifacts. What do they do with these artifacts? Some museums have decided, all right, it's time to send back these artifacts. So there's a museum in DC that was made to send back some artifacts under intense legal pressure. Some universities that have also come into possession of these things have started sending them back. Cornell recently sent all these cuneiform tablets that it had illegally acquired right back. But the responsibility is greater than that. Like if you find as a university, as a museum, that you're sitting on all of these artifacts that were collected, stolen, packaged, and sent to your institution by predominantly white colonialists, how do you make it so that communities who have been violently deprived of these artifacts have an opportunity to set up their own museums for these artifacts? How do you make it so that these communities, once the artifacts come back, are in a position to develop curatorial practices around these artifacts, use them in teaching, build learning institutions where these artifacts can receive a new life as centers for cultural expression? So that to me is like the big work, right? Like this is how you would scale up from simply saying, as I and others have done, that there are like these legacies of whiteness and white supremacy that are embedded in the fields that we study, to like this longer term project that would say, all right, like we have these legacies, so what do we do to engage in restitution, in reparative work, in making it feasible for communities to having access to these artifacts, actually center them in the life of these communities, especially, but not only war-torn communities, which is why I use the ancient Near East and the modern Near East as an example.
Professor, I'm getting messages from some of my colleagues saying that we could listen to you all morning and that you're making us want to go back to college and take your classes. But I think we just have time for 2 more. I'm going to try to sneak in 2 more. And I'm going to send it to Lexi next. Lexi, you're up.
Hi, my name is Lexi, and I learned that you have previously taught in Columbia's Justice Education Initiative for formerly incarcerated adults. My question for you is, why do you think it is important to have these types of programs for formerly incarcerated people?
Thanks so much for that question. I'll say something very quickly about the program's emergence, and then I'll sort of talk about why I decided to become involved and support the program in as many ways as I could. So this program that was launched at Columbia while I was a postdoc there, followed in the footsteps of other programs that have been launched at institutions throughout the United States. And these programs have made it increasingly clear and arose originally from the conviction that the carceral state and imprisonment performs many kinds of violence. One of the most devastating forms of violence is that it systematically deprives whole communities of the opportunities to learn. So when some of us were in conversation about and this initiative at Columbia, we had several objectives. One, of course, was to address the fact that, especially following a monumentally misguided legislative decision in the 1990s, funding for prison education dried up. How could we, working mainly at private institutions such as Columbia, rectify that? Take what was a wrong, a real wrong that was inflicted on folks who were incarcerated, as well as folks who had been released from incarceration, and make it a site for justice. But there's a second reason here, and some of the rationale behind that second reason I tried to give expression to in a piece that came out earlier this fall. How many of you folks have been on Columbia's campus or right near campus? Just raise your hand, just a show of hands is good enough. All right. So before I started working at Columbia, I would often walk to Columbia's campus, especially when I was a teenager. When I was on Columbia's campus, I had the sense, especially when I was a teenager, that I was kind of being watched. There were eyes on me. And even after I started working there from time to time, especially when I was entering certain buildings, folks would look at me some kind of way, or they'd ask me questions, and I'd be like, I work here, right? So I know this is the racial gaze that operates in all these other contexts, right? And I began to understand that Columbia's relationship with the greater community, the Morningside Heights community, the Hamilton Heights community, the Central Harlem community, the Morningside Heights community, was a relationship that, in elevating Columbia as an Ivy League institution, as a research institution, rested nonetheless on forms of racial discrimination, right? Some of that's very spatial. Like if you go to Columbia's campus, you could like see how the spaces are organized in ways that limit the interaction or the capacity of interaction between people who are at Columbia and people who live in some of these neighboring communities, right? But as I thought more about this, it became all the more meaningful to think of how that campus could be opened up. There are many other programs at Columbia that were trying to do similar work. But for me in the Justice and Education Initiative, one of the axes that I saw as most important to center was the opening up of Columbia's campus to recently released citizens, right? Because there were no opportunities for them that would bring them onto campus. There were no structures that would enable them to access the resources of Columbia's campus, even though Columbia has this staggering wealth of resources. And those were the motivations for me. I think in the longer term, one of the issues that I had to grapple with too was the fact that for much of my childhood and adolescence, whenever I interacted with folks who had been incarcerated or folks who were currently at the time incarcerated, the patterning of those experiences always rested on the belief that, well, if you don't behave right, that's going to be you, right? And like I had mentors who told me that like very explicitly. So to think about that, just like think about that for a moment, that I was brought up in an environment where all of these expectations were put on my shoulders. And I was also told at the same time, if you mess up, you're going to go to prison, just like these folks, just like your second cousins. And when I became an adult, I realized like how awfully terrible this was and how awfully terrible the experiences of those folks whom I knew well who have been incarcerated have been. And that to me was like the most potent justification for becoming involved in the initiative.
Thank you for sharing. That's such important work. We're going to go to Leilani for our last question of the morning.
Hi, my name is Leilani. I'm in the 8th grade and I'd like to thank you for being our speaker for today. I read in your biography that you grew up in East Harlem. Can you share with us some of your favorite memories growing up here?
Oh, where would I begin? I'm gonna tell you about one of my favorite memories because it involves something I'm gonna do next week. I love Patsy's Pizza so much. I mean, y'all, last time I was in the city the other week, I just bought 2 pies and I ate a pie and a half in like 5 minutes. It's great. It's delicious. So my favorite memories all involve walking along the East River Promenade. I'm a walker, so like sometimes I run, but usually I just try to get on walks. And I just love going on the East River. I don't mind the noise of the FDR, it's mad loud, but it's very calming to me. I used to spend many afternoons on the walk from 116th or 119th and 2nd to Columbia and back. I just liked that walk, partly because I hoped that one day I would go to a place like Columbia, but also because I liked how I would travel across all these different communities, like on my way to and from. Something that's still true now. You travel from a barrio that is becoming Latin Americanized in like a very different way, right? So like when I was growing up, there was still a significant Puerto Rican population, and now that has transformed, like a strong Central American presence. And I would move then through Little Africa on 116th. I would then keep walking up until I got to Morningside. I'd say though that some of these favorite experiences are like now tinged with bittersweetness, in some cases just like sourness, and I should be forthright about those too. One of the things that my mom and I spent a lot of time discussing in the past few years before the pandemic was how the escalation of deportations, like really cut a swath through communities in East Harlem and in Washington Heights too. The pandemic then played this out on a different level. So I know folks will have had experiences of the pandemic that touched them in pretty profound ways. What I'll say about the pandemic is that my mom lost 6 of her friends within about 2.5 months of the start of the pandemic. And so many of the memories of El Barrio for me are, just wired to like the networks of friends that my mom was able to build up over the years. And the kinds of communities that she was able to lead and sustain through her church work. And some of the folks who were most prominent in those circles are now no longer with us, right? So as I walk through East Harlem and sort of relive the memories of my adolescence and young adulthood whenever I'm back, I think often of absences. I think of the folks who are not there. I think about like what it would mean to honor their memories faithfully, to honor the memories of the neighborhood that proved so definitive and decisive for me. And that too serves as motivation for the work I see myself doing now.
Thank you so much for everything that you've shared this morning. It's been really, really interesting, and we've just been fascinated to learn from you. Autumn is going to lead us in another brief meditation, and then Ivan will offer some final remarks for the morning.
1, 2, 3. One, two, three.
Thanks, Autumn. Just wonderful, Professor. You speak with depth and expansiveness and lyricism and warmth, and your life is a wonderful example for so many classical values. And for me, the keynote as I read your memoir, listening to you, is it's not so much the intellect, which is that's the obvious one, but you have a depth of courage. I mean, to bear witness when you're a college kid and take the weight of international scrutiny. It would have been so easy for you to just kind of pass through and become a classic scholar, but you went deep and you went broad, and you are really the embodiment of what we strive to do here. Your life is grounded, and at the same time, it's deeply transcendent. And as a world-renowned intellectual, I really encourage you to be even more broadly a public intellectual, because you touched all of us here, the professionals, the students, not just so much what you said, but how you said it. You're a person of great honor and integrity, and I'm proud that you're a son of El Barrio, and I'm so glad that somebody strong and wise like you is shoulder to shoulder with the best of people in this beautiful struggle. I don't know if you have any final words, Michael, to give tribute to Professor, and then Professor will let you end with a few valedictory words this time.
Well, firstly, thank you, Danelle. Professor, if you've already shared so much time with us, if you do have a minute after this, I'd love to just say hello again, along with Reed and Zach Squire, who are actually on the Zoom. And Ivan, if you have time, I'll send you all a link, just a few minutes. But I would echo exactly what Ivan said, which is the courage, which I understand Danelle wouldn't be talking much about. No one wants to boast about it themselves, so they need a third party to make it clear. There's nothing obvious or easy about Danelle's path. I think he made that clear, but it wasn't simply the circumstances, but it was also the decisions, because I actually haven't spoken with Danelle for over 15 years. And I get to admire and follow his journey from afar. But when he talks about his documentation status, where he talks about how he would like to change the classics field of study, he talks about it so casually and logically here. But there is a lot of opposition to a lot of the things that I think of the views that we all hold common. And it sometimes churns my stomach to read that opposition. I understand the world is full of friction and debate, and that's just life as a child and as an adult. But he made some very tough decisions, and I'm sure he has to endure a lot that he didn't describe today. And if we ever have a follow-up talk, I think just hearing your perseverance through that would also be motivational for a lot of the students here. But thank you so much, Dana.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to all of you, especially the 8th graders who asked me such excellent questions. It's been nothing short of an honor to be in your company this morning. And I hope that our paths will converge again in the not too distant future. And who knows, you may find me just around the corner from EHS, just nibbling away at some patsies. So I hope to see each and every single one of you soon.
Bravo. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. All right, dear people. It's when I was a kid, my father, I mean, the professor, by the way, might be in a conventional sense, but in a deep sense, the wisest person I've ever met in my life. So you guys were a wonderful audience. So I mean, the professor gave you tribute, but when the students are ready, a teacher shall appear. But what a wonderful teacher, and what a beautiful and inspirational life. So I hope at some point some of you will become students down in Princeton and get to learn from him. But I'm going to follow you, Professor, closely. I just had so much fun listening to you speak. I think it was at Barnard College. And you gave me a short reading list too, that with Hartman and Trujillo and Fuentes. You also mentioned a great Dominican poet. I was taking notes about her too, and I did a little Espaillat. So I'm going to check her out too. And if you're in Princeton and you need us to run a pizza by 116th Street to your mother, we're gonna send some people over there. But anyway, I hope we see you in real life soon. And again, thank you so much. Be well.